Courtney looked out the window of the council chamber. Thanks to the deep ledges, no water splashed in from the outside. Despite that comfort, she couldn't help but shudder at the intensity of the storm. It hadn't started out that way, though she supposed she should have known that would change. A light sprinkle occupied the morning, gradually increasing as the day moved on. Kern had told them all he'd had contact from Tyler and that they were headed this way. She hoped they weren't caught out in that. Not sure how far away they were from home. Part of her feared they'd be on the steep inclines leading up to Lindworm, but she chastised herself for thinking that. The afternoon only grew darker as the rain poured down. The other dragons and mages had taken shelter, content to wait things out, but she couldn't help but stare out and wonder, how many mages were they bringing with them? Just how skilled were they? How much help would they actually provide? And how were they going to house them all? Even with the steady repairs in the city outside the gates, there wasn't much room for more. As the intensity of the storm increased, everyone had sought better shelter inside the mountain, especially with the threat of flash flooding through the ruined city. They'd even taken the risk of jamming the doors shut to keep the rain out. She was assured they could open them again without the key since they were already inside. That, and they weren't actually sealed. Kern paced the council chamber floor in dragon form, looking deep in thought as he stared out the window. And then, for no reason she could fathom, the Nurrim rushed out of the chamber. It seemed as though someone had called out to him on some urgent matter. She stared at the empty doorway, wondering what was going on. The roar of the rain threatened to drive her mad. She sought the more quiet parts of the underground city to block out the sound. She had barely reached the main corridor when Kern swept back in. The slack form of Anwen hung in his front claws. Courtney ran forward with a gasp as the dragon lowered the half-drowned girl to the floor. She had no idea why the Nurrim had brought Anwen straight here and not the others, but those thoughts were brushed aside as she threw herself down next to her friend.
Bring towels and warm mead,
the Nurrim ordered some of his subordinates. The smaller dragons ran to obey his command, skittering across the stones in their haste. The blonde mage lifted Anwen into her arms, ignoring her soaked clothes.
You're ice cold,
she declared, her teeth chattering from the contact. It reminded her of when Anwen had fallen into Lake Wyvern. At least she was breathing.
Where did you find her?
She asked the dragon, having to crane her neck to look him in the eye. Kern towered over the two mages, not bothering to transition to his smaller form.
She called me as she battled against the flash flood threatening to sweep them all off the mountainside. By whatever means, she managed to spare them all from that fate, but at some cost to herself.
Courtney shuddered at the thought, not sure what all the ordeal entailed, but made a guess anyway. She shook her head as she looked down at Anwen's pale face in wonder.
You're something else,
she whispered to her friend.
And one of these days, I want to hear the whole story behind this.
It took the mage a while to wring some of the water from Anwen's clothes. By that time, one of the dragons had approached with a large towel. It looked more like a blanket due to the sheer size of it, but Courtney took it in good measure, wrapping her friend in the warmed fabric. As if woken to her current plight, Anwen began to shiver violently. Her eyes opened, though she flinched against the light.
Where am I?
She asked, not immediately recognizing her surroundings.
Be at ease, daughter.
Kern rumbled.
You are safe, as are your companions. I brought you back ahead of the others, as you seemed to need what they could not provide.
He reached his head down towards her, breathing his warm breath over her body. The heat of his breath sent Anwen's body to tingling, steam rising from every inch of her skin, her cheeks flushed from the intensity. She couldn't help but let out a sneeze right as another dragon came up with a mug of requested mead.
Excuse me,
she said almost immediately. The dragon had managed to stand right in the path of her violent exhalation, not appearing too put out by the outburst. The dragon set down the mug of brew and left with a bow. Kern watched as the Keda gave the mug an askance glance.
You should drink it,
he urged.
I promise no one has laced it with salvia divinum. And while I know you do not like alcohol in general, think of it as a preventative against further ill effects.
With a hint of misgiving, Anwen reached towards the mug. The motion disheveled the massive towel around her. She took a tentative sip of the drink, feeling the warmth burn down through the length of her body. She doubted she could finish the whole mug and left it with the one sip.
I feel exhausted,
she admitted. Courtney moved to help her stand.
I'll take you to your room,
she offered.
Just lean on me.
She couldn't help but notice how Anwen drooped, even when pressed against her for support. Whatever ordeal she'd gone through must have taken a lot out of her. Kern Kern watched as the two teens moved down the corridor. His expression remained thoughtful as he contemplated what the Keda had done. It was possible she was more advanced than he'd thought possible at this stage. He hoped such was the case, for all of their sakes. The Nurrim waited until he'd returned to his chamber to collapse. It took a great deal of willpower to keep his body upright, but he managed. The moment he entered his personal room, he made his way to the padded sleep area and fell into it. The padding dampened any noise his sudden drop may have caused, but not entirely. Callum entered Kern's chamber not too long after his collapse. His eyes went wide at the sight of his leader lying so against the bedding.
My lord Nurrim,
He breathed as he hurried over to his father.
what ails you?
He reached out a tentative clawed hand, pulling back. Kern turned his massive neck so he could look at his son without too much strain.
Callum, I did not realize you had followed me.
He confessed. He sounded more than tired.
What ails me?
He coughed a few times, his body shuddering.
Nothing, but that I am old.
The silver-green dragon dropped to one knee to touch his leader on the shoulder.
Your scales seem colder than normal.
He observed.
Is it because you went after the Keda in the rain? You should have sent someone else.
His claws seemed to flutter over the white scales, not sure what to do.
I can perform a healing, if you would allow it.
But the great dragon shook his head.
Oh, my son. I thank you for your concern. But this is not something anyone can deter. My time grows short. It is possible that I may not last to the confrontation ahead. But I beg you not to mention this to any others.
Callum reared up so fast he almost hit the ceiling.
Not tell the others.
His eyes went wide at the implications.
My lord, you can't be serious in your current condition.
Kern waved one scaled arm.
All will be well.
He assured.
I need only rest. This will not affect the current course of events, I assure you. Yes, rest would be good.
He wound his tail around his body, pulling his limbs in close as he rested his head on his folded arms. His brilliant eyes closed and the gentle sound of snoring issued from between his lips and nose. The younger dragon contemplated his slumbering leader. This did not bode well for any of them. He knew Kern was old, but he never thought to see him like this. He was the eldest, the first of all dragons. He could not succumb to age like this. He wouldn't allow it. With a fist to his other palm in determination, Callum swung around to the door. He would find a way to change this. He had to. Kern was his pillar. He couldn't go on without him, no matter what the others might say. Walter woke with a start when Tyler nudged him. The rain had continued, pouring down for some time. The veteran couldn't help but fall asleep to its rhythmic sound, but when Tyler touched him, he immediately woke up. He said in the initial confusion. Tyler shook his head, though he didn't blame the man. The rain had continued on for several good hours after Anwen's hasty evacuation by Kern. Now the sky reflected the faint hints of sunset through the clouds. Despite this, the clouds were still quite thick.
Rain's letting up.
The dragon announced.
We should head out so we can make the village before it gets too dark.
A tap on the window brought both of their attentions to the driver's side of the car as Leslie looked in the vehicle. Walter rolled down the window.
Hi.
He greeted as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes.
Tyler says we should head on up.
I was just about to ask about that.
Leslie confirmed.
I'll pass the message down the line.
She turned back to her truck, moving out of sight. Walter let out a sigh as he watched her before she disappeared from view. But he returned his attention to the task at hand once she was out of sight. He turned over the ignition, attempting to get the engine going a few times before it finally caught. Then, careful not to slide around in the still, wet road, he set the car in motion. Almost as if the car didn't want to go, it shuddered at the press of his foot on the gas pedal. The tires slid against the slick road. They almost went off to one side, but Walter managed to avert that disaster by turning into the skid instead of away from it as most people would.
Come on, baby.
He coaxed as he eased up on the gas a little so they could get some momentum before accelerating.
Should I get out and push?
Tyler joked, trying to lighten the mood. The look he got in return told him his words were not appreciated, and he decided to remain silent in the matter. If anyone could get them going, it was Walter, and the man didn't need any more distractions than necessary. Finally, after some more encouragement on his part, the car began moving forward at an even pace. It wasn't anywhere near close to the speed limit, but at least they were moving. The gas gauge showed half empty with everything else at decent levels, so they pressed on. Before too long, they'd reached the last uphill climb and Walter had to downshift the gears.
Come on.
He encouraged over and over again as the vehicle crawled up the slope. The others held back to make sure he'd make it all the way up before trying to ascend, which he appreciated. The vehicle was in better condition than the bus Tyler and Anwen had used that one time to reach the village. Despite that, Walter's rental had more than enough trouble. The roads continued to swell with the rainwater, even with the lighter precipitation. But after some careful maneuvering, they made it. Walter wiped sweat from his brow, turning down the defrost on the vents. The window started to fog over slightly around the edges as he did, but he didn't care. They'd made it. He was more than happy to pull in at the Dritty Inn. The mages followed a little more confidently behind him. They parked their larger vehicles in whatever spots they could find. Leslie exited her vehicle, signaling the others to wait. Chances were good the good villagers were not preparing to offer housing to them. Tyler slammed his door shut as he stretched tensed muscles. Part of him wished he'd been able to sleep through that last half hour, but felt glad he hadn't. He'd done a little coaxing of his own to keep them on the road. He somehow doubted Walter was aware of his contributions. He tried to keep them on the down low for a reason.
Well,
Leslie said as she approached the Dragon Lord.
now that we're here, where should we bed down for the night? I'm sure the locals won't willingly share their space.
But Tyler shook his head.
There are several houses sitting empty after the last battle.
He countered.
I'm sure no one will begrudge you the use of them. There's also the town hall we can use as well.
Walter came around as Tyler finished talking, only to nod in agreement.
He's right. I don't think you'll find a majority of the mages as missish as they were when you all left.
He shivered a bit in the chill mountain air.
You won't. I'll show you where the empty houses are.
The walker nodded.
Alright, we want to keep most of our gear in the trucks anyway. At least until we get things all arranged.
With that, she followed the veteran down the street. She signaled for her people to follow, Sarah joining them. Tyler didn't wait to see what they'd do. Instead, he headed to the inn, the bell chiming overhead as he opened the door. Since it was well into the night, he didn't expect anyone to be up and about. As a result, he was surprised to see Mr. Willis coming from the back room to greet him.
Evening.
He supplied at his initial greeting.
Nasty night out, isn't it?
Mr. Willis gave him a crinkled smile.
Been a while since we last saw you.
He reprimanded.
I take it you're back from whatever mission you were on?
Tyler nodded, too tired to deny anything. He had no idea how much the villagers knew of his and the others' mission. Part of him supposed it must be common knowledge by now, though.
We've brought a lot of friends back with us to help with things. Walter's setting them up for the night.
The proprietor nodded.
Let me know if they need anything, and I'll see to it.
He allowed.
In the meantime, looks like you need a room to rest in for a bit.
Not able to deny it, Tyler merely nodded again.
That would be nice. And an early wake-up if you don't see me before 7 in the morning.
He requested. He followed him up the stairs on leaden feet to the room opposite the one Walter used. He was too tired to go up to the mountain tonight. Mr. Willis nodded his agreement, though part of him thought better of it. The young man looked more than ready to sleep for a good 2 or 3 days, though. But knowing who he was, he had no call to meddle in his affairs and to let it be.
Sleep well,
He said as he closed the room's door behind him. Tyler moved to the bed, kicking his wet shoes before flinging himself against the bedding. He closed his eyes, reaching out to Anwen with his senses. From what he could tell, she was sleeping soundly. At least there was that, he sighed. Well, he'd see her sooner or later, and so decided to let himself drift off for the night. Everything else could wait until the morning.